Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with host Jacob Berman. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Timothy Freke. One of the things that he's most well known for is publishing of his book. It's called the Jesus. Let's see here. It's called the Jesus Mysteries. Was the original Jesus a pagan god? I found the book to be quite fascinating, and I'm going to have the link to it in the description below, his Amazon page. A lot of his information is in the description too, so you can go check out his stuff. He also appeared on the documentary film Caesar's Messiah, and a film that I have watched quite a few times. And today he joins us to talk about why he thinks Jesus is derived from paganism. Okay, so that takes me to my first question for you. So Dr. Freke, from which pagan source do you think Jesus is mostly derived from?
I don't think there's any one source, Jacob, which is why it's not obvious. I mean, if there was one ancient pagan story which was identical in some way, then the Jesus story wouldn't be novel, it wouldn't be new, and it would be obvious. So I see it much more like human creativity always is. So if you think about science fiction stories, our own myths of today, you take a great science fiction story like The Matrix, and if you know your science fiction, you can see, oh, that's come from there, that's come from there, that's like that. And they've put it together into a new, literally in this case, The Matrix, as it happens, is a Gnostic fantasy. It's like a very similar Gnostic myth. In the ancient world, the currency is mythology, not science fiction. And you have all of these different myths which revolve around lots of figures, but the figure we're interested in is a dying and resurrecting God-man or son of God in the form of Osiris, Dionysus, Serapis, Attis, Adonis, all these figures. And what you see in their stories is the repertoire of mythic motifs, which are themselves teaching stories, which will become integrated in a brand new way in this brilliant new mythos that's going to emerge. And it itself, I think, emerges gradually, and lots of different people add to it, which gives us then the Jesus story. And although it's not the same, it shares what Joseph Campbell calls the same anatomy. When he was talking about myths, he talked about them having similar anatomies. And the analogy which works for me with that is if you think of two things which are very, very different, like Romeo, Juliet and West Side Story. It's like, well, they're completely different, but they're not, are they? They've got the same anatomy. It's the same story in a different way. And that's what you see with all of these myths, not just with the Jesus myth, but the development and the evolution of the pagan myths, which then I think in Alexandria in Egypt or somewhere, I think that's the most likely place, with a group of Jewish-speaking Greek-speaking Jews, which you've got in Alexandria. You see this crossover of paganism and Judaism, because it's not just paganism. There's also a lot of Jewish motifs as well.
I noticed that throughout the book, you have heavily focused on one of the most focused parallels, maybe the most focused parallels I've noticed, as you pointed out, is Jesus's parallels to Dionysus and Osiris. You often like to put Dionysus, Osiris, as you like to call that god. Dionysus, as you know, he gets torn apart and then put back together in Greek mythology. Would you say that is an obvious derivation from Osiris?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these myths are feeding into each other. We were working at, when we wrote the book, I mean, it's a long time ago now, but we were looking, Peter Gandy and I were looking for, how do we refer to this composite figure? So we just chose the two biggest versions, which is Osiris, which is probably the earliest we know of in Egypt, and then Dionysus, which is derived directly from Osiris, where, and it's important when you're dealing with Dionysus to recognize which Dionysus was talking about, because Dionysus is kind of a Greek wine god who gets transformed into Osiris probably by Pythagoreans in the secret ceremonies that will become Eleusis, the huge initiation ceremonies. So yeah, these are similar stories which are evolving and changing, and will feed into this amalgamation of, I think, it looks like, I mean, you've got to be very tentative, Jacob, with all of this, really, and just go for what's the most plausible given the evidence. But you take a group like the Therapeutai in Alexandria, I was saying at this time, just before what we call zero. Of course, there is no time zero, I don't think, but before that date, you have groups like the Therapeutai, and we hear about that group. They sound like Pythagoreans. They dress like Pythagoreans. They're vegetarians and so forth, but they are Jews, and we hear about them from Philo Judaeus, Philo the Jew, who's also called Philo the Pythagorean. So it looks like we have a group of Jewish Pythagoreans, Jewish pagans in the desert around Alexandria, putting together Jewish mythology, and they seem to be following the mysteries of Moses. So you've got as a initiatory allegory, they're taking the Exodus myth, which is seen as a journey towards gnosis, awakening, enlightenment, we might say today, but they call it gnosis in the Greek. So that's what they're using. And in the Exodus story, Moses, of course, doesn't take you to the promised land. That's Joshua. And the promised land is gnosis. But Joshua in Greek is Jesus. So they're already practicing the mysteries of Jesus already. And they're going to merge that. They're surrounded by this incredible pagan culture in Egypt, which is now a Greek pagan culture. You've got crossover Greek and Egyptian deities like Serapis, who's another figure like this. And they're going to start merging their own Jewish mythology and pagan mythology. And the great thing is, the thing I find the most convincing, which people don't seem to take enough notice of, is the intertestamental texts, as they're called, which is a whole load of texts written between when we think some of the what we call the Old Testament texts were written and what we call the New Testament texts were written. And these texts are just dismissed because they're not in the canon. But there's a whole range of texts, and they all combine Jewish and pagan mythology quite clearly. And no one, I think, would dispute that. So we have this strange situation where, although everyone would accept that these intertestamental texts are crossovers between the cultures, we then get these other texts come out of it afterwards about the dying and resurrecting God-man Jesus, and everyone goes, oh no, that's nothing to do with paganism, even though the other earlier ones clearly were.
When do you think that this process started? When the Christian process, that is, when
Christianity? Well, yeah. I suspect it goes the bringing together of the transformation from Joshua, from this figure, he's a kind of genocidal nationalist, into the Prince of Peace, into the God-man who brings gnosis, and the change from Jehovah, who's this tribal god, into the God of love. I mean, a monumental shift, an evolution of thought, and a very interesting combination of different cultures. I suspect it's a few hundred years BC is when it's starting, and it really takes off maybe 50 BC or maybe a bit earlier, and you start getting these crossovers, and it will then keep going for the next 100 years or so until we get the stories that we're familiar with now, which I think have been cobbled together from all sorts of different sources, but not. This is the thing that people often misunderstand. I think they kind of think it's some sort of conspiracy or done malevolently. Now, I think probably, you know, once it becomes politicized, but that's way in the future, that's when it gets into the hands of the Romans, then maybe there is some degree of politicization and corruption and all the rest of it. But basically it's not. I mean, basically it's people of goodwill developing this incredible Gnostic fantasy, which is so powerful and contains such amazing ideas. It still resonates with us today. It's still having an effect. I think it's an incredible, great piece of work. It's like people often say, look, what, there must have been a Jesus because someone had to say this. And I always feel like, if you look at Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, I mean, it's fantastic, but you don't think, well, there must have been a Hamlet who, because somebody said that. Well, it was Shakespeare. He was the genius. And the same with this. The people who are the geniuses are the people who are putting together the Sermon on the Mount and indeed the whole story as well, which is beautifully crafted and full of meaning, symbolic meaning.
Yeah, when you brought up that point there about a certain degree of politicization that occurred in late in the game, in the first century CE, late first century CE or so.
I think later than that. Right?
Yeah. To what degree do you think that? How far do you think that could have gone? Because that kind of takes me to this question of what do you think of Joseph Atwill's theory about the Flavians and their involvement? To what degree do you think the parallels between Titus and Jesus could feed into this situation?
I am not convinced by it, Jacob. And I think what's happening is that the same pagan myths are playing into both developments. So as early as, Augustus is drawing deliberately on those myths to portray himself in a certain light, but on somewhere else, the same myths are giving birth to this new vision of Gnostic mythology. And the crossovers are there because they've come from the same root. But the myths themselves, I think the Christian myths are Gnostic myths. They're not being produced by Romans.
So you just said that they're Gnostic myths. So does that mean you think that the Gnostic ideology is older?
I think the Gnostics are the original Christians. I think what you can, they're the great heresy. The great thing they were condemned for was that they'd gone pagan. They were Christians who'd gone pagan. That's why they were attacked so much in the 3rd, 4th centuries. Actually, I think the historical record suggests the opposite way around, that the Gnostics are practicing the Jesus mysteries. They are practicing a mystery school. They speak in the language of the Greek mysteries, and they are developing a strand of Jewish paganism. That's what they're doing, and it will later become literalized. And therefore, the early documents, for me, they're all Gnostic, which is why that's why they're allegories. And they're encoding allegories that lead to gnosis. And the reason that it's probably started much, much earlier than people normally think, because we get mesmerized by this illusory year zero. Once you lose the year zero, you're free then to go, okay, so wonder when it did start. And the fact that very, very early on, there are so many different Gnostic schools, and they're all different, very different sometimes, suggests that it's been fermenting for quite a while for it to disperse. And if you look at this 1st century, the early literalists like Tertullian and Irenaeus and people like that, you get Justin Martyr, you can see that one of them, I forget which one it was now, describes the whole of Asia as being full of Gnostics. Well, how the hell did that happen? It's like they seem to be a much larger movement, and not this sort of kind of small fringe that they're later portrayed to be. And I suspect it's because this tradition had been bubbling up and then has turned into lots of different offshoots, as things do, or with different, some seem very anti-body and anti the world, and some don't. Some really engage with it. Some are ecstatic, some are quite ascetic. And all that must take time to develop. So I think that's, but I would, one of the big, when we were writing the book, there was a key moment which was troubling me, which was Paul, because we were doing this research and everything seemed to make sense. It was like, it was like watching a train go into a tunnel as paganism and come out on the other side as Christianity. And it was like, wow, what happened in the tunnel? And the big problem was that I was obvious that the letters of Paul are the earliest Christian documents, specifically Christian documents, generally acknowledged to be anyway, that we have. And so that troubled me. It was like, well, what's Paul then? And this is a long time ago now when we were researching it, 25 years or something. And that's when we stumbled upon the excellent work done by Elaine Pagels in the Gnostic Paul, in which she showed that Paul was a Gnostic, and that he was the great hero of the Gnostics, and therefore, and suddenly it was like, I see, okay, so the whole of the early Christian movement is Gnostic, and then later it's going to become literalized. And even, even in the early literalists, you see the acknowledgement of the mythic element being the same as the pagan myths. They're aware of that in a way that modern audiences aren't. When I tell people today, there were myths very similar to the Jesus story, they're shocked. But in the ancient world, obviously, they weren't shocked because they were familiar with them. And that's where you get this lovely idea that the devil came in advance and spread all these myths, so that when Jesus actually came, people would be confused, and that kind of plagiarism in advance argument. So it's a very different world then.
Do you think the split between Christians and Gnostics started because, like, they'll often say that Simon Magus is the founder of the movement, and he's supposed to be contemporary with Paul, but there's also Marcion. Although, I mean, some people would say, Marcion is very similar to Gnostics, and he is very similar. He has very similar views to the Gnostics. So where do you think this split started, with Marcion or Simon Magus?
I think you've got to completely turn the conventional history. You got to just let go of the conventional history completely. So instead, you see this developing organic schools of Jewish Gnosticism. And at the center of this Jewish Gnosticism is the figure of Joshua, in the Greek, Jesus, who is the Messiah. And the Messiah is the person who's going to lead you to the gnosis. And that is fermenting away in all these different forms. And they, just like today, they all disagree with each other. And there's lots of little petty rivalries and all the rest of it. And another group will come out of this eventually, which have got a different take again. And their take is, it actually happened. That's what makes this different. This actually is a history. All the others are just myths. And this is a brand new idea, and it makes it very, very attractive because it's new in a crowded marketplace like today. That's a very different message. And it has an appeal, and it takes off. And then for various quirks of history that I'm sure you're already very aware of, as probably your audience is too, that gets taken up eventually by the Roman Empire, and that becomes the Christianity. So now that's Christianity. Well, in the early, that's not Christianity. There's lots of Christianities. There's lots of, Christianity is about the myth of the Messiah. And they've got all sorts of different versions. And then it becomes this version. And then it turns on all the others. It turns on everything. It turns on Judaism, it turns on paganism, and it turns on all of its Gnostic rivals until only it exists. And you get the official history, Eusebius, and starts that whole process. This is the official history of the church. And then that's what we're left with, because that's been so dominant in our history. It's only now, gradually over the last 300-400 years, that we've been able to unpick all of this and go back and go, oh, hang on, was that what really happened? I don't think it is.
One of the sharpest differences between the Gnostics and the Christians is that the Christians, they accept the Jewish God, the Yahweh. They think that he's Jesus' father, but the Gnostics, they reject Yahweh. They think he's the devil, and Jesus is the son of a higher God.
Yep.
So since you think the Gnostics came first, practically, when do you think the Christian rejection of that idea, and when do they revise their religion to incorporate Yahweh back in as the benevolent deity and as Jesus' father?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an absolutely fascinating question, Jacob, because it's obviously not a very easy thing to do, because Yahweh isn't a benevolent deity by any stretch of the imagination, and you've only got to read the text, and that's as clear as day. He's a tribal thunder god, a jealous deity fighting off other deities. He's a god of his time, and the god of the Gnostic Christians is much more like Plato's God. It's much more the one. It's love. It's a revolution, and it's a huge leap forward. And that's that. So it can take the message which has been developing in pagan thought, and really this message of love is quite extraordinary, I think, and forgiveness and just beautiful stuff. Very hard to tie with Yahweh. So, and I remember very, very well, a little personal anecdote, but when I was young, I almost became a friar at one point in my life. And the gentleman who was my mentor, a lovely, lovely man, just full of love and compassion and goodness. And we used to get up in the morning, and you had to do the special stuff and read the special things, and we'd always have to read this passage from some passage from the Old Testament. And I'd go to him, Bernard, he was called Brother Bernard. Why do you read that horrible stuff? Because it was horrible. I mean, you know what it's like. It's vile. And he just look really ambitious and embarrassed, and just don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. And it was like, because he was worshiping a God of love. He wanting to bring goodness into the world, and there was these ghastly. I mean, some of the stuff. I mean, it's so violent and vile. So a hell of a job to get it back to that God. I think it served a purpose. I think that's the honest answer, Jacob. And I think it has served a purpose ever since, because what it enables you to do politically is it enables you to justify anything, because everything's in the book. So if you want to encourage forgiveness, there's lots of lovely forgiveness stuff. But if you want to encourage vengeance and violence, there's plenty of violence to call on as well. And I think part of the success of Roman Christianity was that built-in ambivalence, that it could draw on whatever it wanted, and especially to an audience who didn't read the originals, you could just bring out whatever it was you wanted to bring out. And so I think that's why it was successful. I think also there was a kind of a thing in the ancient world as well, which may have been important, which was the idea of tradition, that it was old and it went back. And so being able to claim this ancient lineage, gave it some foundation. The other element, I think, which should not be underestimated, is that the Jesus myth is very much, it does draw on Jewish mythology. It's not paganism. It's a hybrid. And so it is linked to the story of Genesis. It's very much, Jesus is coming to redeem the story of Genesis. This is what's so funny to me about people who are quite happy to go, yeah, Genesis is obviously a myth, but Jesus is real, and yet they're part of the one myth. And so you kind of need some of that in order to make sense of the Jesus story. So I think that's the other element that made people want to hang on to it. I wish they hadn't, personally. The new is so much better, I think, in terms of human evolution of human consciousness.
So I want to go back to the earliest Christians. Do you think they read texts like, say, 3rd Enoch, which claims that Metatron is the lesser Yahweh, or texts like Philo, the Testament of Moses, that's turning Moses into a god? Because there are certain texts that turn a Jewish character into a deity. And that when I noticed that, I was like, I reacted like, this must have influenced Christianity to a point, because you have these Jews that believe in a second God. And there are scholars out there that think that monotheism didn't even really exist in Jesus' time anyway, that different Jews believed in different gods, or they're monolatry, that they believed in Yahweh, like focused on Yahweh, but they accepted other gods.
I have great sympathy with that idea. I think we have a very distorted view of Judaism. I don't think it is this monoculture with with one thing, and it's much more various. And I think that Yahweh, the reason that we have even in the Exodus again, he's in competition with other gods, and that's different cults with different attitudes to what you should and shouldn't do, and so there's always all of these rivalries going on. And you're right, there's these crossover texts, these crossover ideas, some of which seem I think to the modern mind quite wonderful, and others completely crazy and like, wow, what was that about? And when I read the literature of the time, even the Gnostic literature, which I like, it's very mixed. The New Testament's very mixed, I think. There's bits of it which are sublime, and there's bits of it which are not very haven't dated well at all.
What do you think of certain texts in the New Testament, like some very odd text, at least it would be odd to a believer for sure, like Revelation 22:16, which makes Jesus out to be the son of Lucifer and David. Then you have John 8:4, which makes out Jesus to be the son of the devil. I mean, not Jesus. I mean, the Jews to be the sons of the devil. And it calls the devil the murderer from the beginning. And some could think, oh, I wonder if it's thinking about Cain there when the text says that. And then there's the census of David.
I think that's the Gnostic thread, possibly, which is Yahweh is the devil. And the idea behind that is very much because he's this vindictive, he's not the God of love. So they're looking at, their mythologies. How can they're I think they're actually experiencing a transcendent gnosis of God. And then they're living in a brutal world full of suffering and evil, and they need an explanation. And they have to do something with Yahweh. It's not like the modern world where you could just go, oh, I just don't believe in that anymore. It's almost like they can't do that. Not yet. It's going to take quite a few hundred years before they can do that. People can do that. So instead, they have to reconceive the idea of Yahweh. So now Yahweh, so they turn it on its head, and it's quite fascinating. So all the goodies are baddies, all the baddies are goodies, because this figure is an oppressive figure. It's the demiurge, the creator of the world. It's a fallen world, which you need to escape from. And that's very much an idea which is in the air across all cultures. You can go to India as well, where I've studied a lot of Indian spirituality, and you get the same idea that we're in a fallen world and we need to escape. It was very much part of, and I think it arises from the experience of gnosis, which is a very real experience. And you go, well, how can this great beauty and love sit alongside this ugliness and suffering and evil? And the most obvious explanation, which people went to, I think it's a wrong one, but they went to it, is, well, this is an evil place created by an evil force. In India, it's the Maya or the Samsara. Here it becomes the devil's playground, or it's Yahweh, the demiurge has done it. And the demiurge, who for Plato is not a negative figure, becomes for the Gnostics a negative. And we are stuck in that world and we need to escape. And it gives you a mythos again of what, how difficult it is to get out, because there's all of these gatekeepers and all of these things keeping you in, which is their own kind of version of something you'll also get in the East. So I think it's a moment in human psychological evolution that we're witnessing. And we see common themes as we go through that phase. But the real big positive development is the idea that God is love, which is a whole new thing and quite a statement.
Do you think Old Testament texts like the census of David, because there's two versions of it. There's one version, an earlier version, that says God ordered the census. Then he gets mad and kills like how many? I think 3,000. And then a later version says it was Satan that caused it. Do you think Gnostics could have noticed that contradiction and said, oh, actually, that can be harmonized by saying Satan is God?
Yeah, I think that's very likely. You know, I think that's their fundamental idea. They're really trying to explain suffering and how to escape it. Same as the Buddhist tradition it was doing a few hundred years previously, or if I'm right and it was happening earlier, around the same time. They're trying to explain why you're trapped in a world of suffering and how the hell you can get out. And the gnosis, or the awakening, depending on, you know, which word you want to use, or the gnana, you could, in the East, it's the same word, is the route out. And you know something, and what you know is the thing which transcends it all. And you know God, and if you can know that, then you will be free. That's what they're fundamentally offering. And then and that's what's so important. The book that I really enjoyed writing the most with Peter was Jesus and the Lost Goddess, which was the second book after the Jesus Mysteries, which is where we went, okay, so if this is an evolutionary myth, this is an evolution of a mythos, why was it so important? Why tell this story in different ways over and over and over? And why did it develop such richness and change a lot, you know, and develop? What is it? And why they think it's an allegory. They think it's a teaching story. So really, this is a great way, actually, Jacob, for people, especially people listening to this who may not know much about what I'm saying, is essentially, you know, if I came on talking to you and I went, hey, you know the story of the Good Samaritan? And nearly everybody does. And then I said, you know what? I've researched it and there was no Good Samaritan. It's a teaching story. Most people will go, well, of course there's no Good Samaritan, you fool. You know, it's like, it's a teaching story. It's a parable. And then what I'm saying is, oh no, the whole thing is a parable. The whole Jesus story is a parable. It's a teaching story. And like the Good Samaritan, looking for the historical basis of it is a complete waste of time. What matters is, what's it a parable about? Why was it important? And so in Jesus and the Lost Goddess, because as I'm sure you know, the Gnostics also didn't just take the story of the father and the son, they also took the story of the mother and the daughter from paganism. They had a quaternity. And looking at what was the Jesus allegory, and the allegory of Jesus and the goddess, what was that allegory about? And I think it's very profound. I think there's a lot in there that's worth bringing out, which we lost in the West when we literalized it, because at that point it became about believing history instead of understanding the allegory. Although, having said that, of course, you can go to literalist churches across the world on any Sunday and you will hear them all draw it out as if it's an allegory. So, you know, Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding. And what this means for us is our everyday lives can be transformed into the joy and ecstasy of wine. So they can't help themselves, because that's what it's designed for. And that's when it has some meaning. Otherwise, it's just something that somebody else did a long time ago. And that's not much use to you.
When it comes to Plato, because Plato, he talks about the demiurge, and I talked about that a lot with one of my previous guests, and he thinks that Plato's demiurge influence had a very strong influence on Gnosticism.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. But you don't have the same negativity towards it. And partly it's because there's a much more, sometimes I feel in the ancient world, you can see a kind of a positive gnosis and a negative gnosis. And no surprise, the people who are having a better time of life have a more positive notice. So Greek aristocrats, they're doing very nicely, thank you very much, tend to think in a much more positive way. And Jews being oppressed by Romans one way or another, tend to think in a more negative way, like it's life is harder. So one is emphasizing the philosophy in a more, there's less of a feeling of this is a weight you have to throw off, but not all Gnostics have that, but some do, but they take that figure for sure. I mean, I think it's I'm trying to think of the academic who said it. I'm not going to remember, but somebody said
it was actually Dr. Rodney Blackhurst.
I don't think I'm thinking of that.
Yeah, that's the he actually appeared on that film too.
The person I'm thinking of was the line which really struck me was Gnosticism is like there's been a riot in Plato's cave. And the idea, which you could see in Plotinus, for instance, which is the Gnostics have re-mythologized Plato. So we've had Plato, and then the philosophers have slowly philosophized out the mythology, and then the Gnostics have come along and taken Platonism and re-mythologized it heavily. And so the riot in Plato's cave is like, it's just gone nuts. It's just full of mythological images now, and you can see that some people loved that, and then people like Plotinus hated it and thought it was a real mistake.
So going back to the late first century CE, later in the game, after the Jewish War happened, do you think when the Jews entered this psychological crisis of, is there more than one God? Is it God's fault? Is it our fault? Which way does it go? And do you think some of them could have gotten so uptight with Yahweh because of the failure of the war that they became Gnostic?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is it is well, I'm pretty sure it started quite a time before that,
right?
And in some ways, I think you could make an argument. It's very hard to say. I want to be tentative with all of this, but I think you know it's quite possible that the Gnostic current was trying to avoid the route that Jewish nationalism was heading down, which was going to lead to the war, and could see the disaster that would ensue. And that's the whole Prince of Peace thing, really, which is trying to bring all this pagan stuff in. But whether that had an effect on some Jewish thinkers, quite possibly. But I think it had already happened. And the thing which is interesting, and you see this obviously in the letters of Paul, and then you see it historically, is that it looks like it's quite difficult for these what are clearly pagan stories to take off amongst Jews or Semites, because eventually it's going to take off mainly in the Gentile, as they say. It's going to take off in the non-Jewish communities. That's where Christianity is going to become so big, which is a incredible irony of history, isn't it? And it already happened. That's the thing. It already happened with Mithraism, which is fascinating as well, to go, oh, hang on. So you've got this Persian version of this mythos, and the Persians are the enemies of the West generally, but certainly the Romans. And yet this is going to take off and cover especially amongst the army, and it's going to cover the empire. And then you've got this other one rising up inside a Jewish format, also the enemy of the Romans, and that's going to take off amongst them, which is a fascinating insight into how all of this works psychologically, I think. And also, just as state the obvious, especially when it's taking off, that the vast majority of people in the Roman Empire aren't Romans, and have got mixed feelings, I suspect, about the empire of which they're a part. So I think there's all sorts of interesting things that are going on that you can attempt to unpick as to why all that happens.
So I kind of want to I want to get back to Marcion for a moment. When Marcion's coming around, I know you're saying that the separation, like Christianity and Gnosticism actually becoming two different things, happened a lot earlier. But by Marcion,
no, I'm not. I think actually the division between Gnostic Christianity and literalist Christianity is actually quite late. I think it starts at the end of the first century, but really takes off in the second and third.
Okay. So by Marcion's time, it seems to be that the division is becoming quite sharp. And then it gets worse, much worse afterwards. In Marcion, he gets excommunicated for his views. The church gets so mad at him that they give him back the money, even that they donated to the church. And he he concluded that, oh, his gospel is first. There are some scholars, and kind of the number is rising slightly from time to time. And I think that the gospels are much later material than we think. People that take the position of Marcion priority, that Marcion's gospel was first. So that kind of means that the Marcionite interpretation of Gnosticism is heavily influencing the Gospels. What do you think about that?
I think it's perfectly possible. I think it's really hard to tell. I mean, the route we took was to really accept what was the mainstream view at the time we were writing 20 years ago. I'm sure it's changed now. And just go, okay, so look, the mainstream view was the three of the Gospels are the same, just Mark and then Matthew and Luke of the different versions of Mark, and then John is different. They're not eyewitness reports. They're not created by somebody who knows Palestinian geography particularly well. They're cobbled together from old saying sources. Sometimes you can see that there's Sophianic wisdom sayings put into the mouth of someone, which was being done, say, in the Hermetic tradition, exactly the same. And they've evolved and been cobbled together. And I say cobbled makes it sound like that's not doing them justice. They've been creatively constructed, actually, I think would be better. When that happened, I mean, obviously, Mark of those group, Mark seems like the earliest. We've got Thomas, of course, as well, just sayings. And then all of these other Gnostic Gospels, all of these Gospels, I mean, so many of them that we've got bits of at least. Where do they all fit in what chronology? God, it's really hard to say. But once you lose the idea that there's actually what happened, and you get more like I said, or take all the science fiction books written in the 1970s or something, and like try and work out which came first and which was influenced by which, and which ones look like they're influenced, but actually they were influenced by a common source, and so on and so on and so on. It's really difficult to do. But the key idea there is these are different interpretations of a mythos until it's literalized. And that's not going to happen for a while. And then once it's literalized, you're in a different world. And again, you've got to forgive me, I haven't looked at this stuff for decades now, really.
Sure.
I will come out as I am with you and talk about it from time to time, but my attention is elsewhere now, so I don't always remember the sources. But it's Irenaeus or Tertullian, or one of them, I think, who talks about, and when he's attacking the Gnostics, of each one of them is not seen as initiated until they've written their own myth, which is a fascinating thing to say, and suggests this idea again that this is an allegory and you need to understand it, and the way you understand it is you create your own mythos of some type. And so there's so many of them, but so then it's like you can see it as a very creative thing. Now, once you've got it literalized, there's one version which is true and all the others are false. Before that, you haven't got true and false in that historical way at all. You've got less or more insightful, perhaps, or different theological claims, but you've got a much more creative cauldron, which is more like what you had in the ancient world already. And then suddenly you introduce this new thing, which is historical veracity. And that's where you're going to start this movement towards a monological fundamentalist thing, as it will become eventually, and still with us is that, because it's like, this is lies and must be stopped. And that mindset then sets out to stop it, because it's evil. It must be stopped.
So do you think that Jesus is basically, I kind of want to go back to the third Enoch situation there, because it makes Metatron out to be the lesser Yahweh. And Jesus is quite clearly portrayed, at the very least, because some texts make out Jesus to be God himself, but in much of the text, he's obviously God's son, the second power in heaven. it makes me feel like Jesus is taking over for Metatron. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, in certain ways. I mean, what I want to try and convey, I think, is how malleable all of this is. So, if you're sitting there going, yeah, I kind of see it like this, and then that will come out. But somebody else will see it differently. And people are trying to create ideas which help them understand the nature of the theology they're exploring. And that's why you get all these different Jesuses. I mean, it's still happening today, even though most Christians are very limited to what texts they're allowed to look at. They still manage to create a different Jesus. There's that lovely line, I think it's Albert Schweitzer, who talks about the deep well effect, that when people go looking for Jesus, they just see themselves reflected back from the bottom of the well. So that if you get a Quaker pacifist sees a lovely pacifist Jesus, and a fundamentalist sees a fire and brimstone Jesus, and a Muslim sees a prophet Jesus, and a Buddhist sees a Buddha Jesus, and a politico sees a political Jesus, and everyone just sees themselves staring back at them, which, as someone who thinks he's the kind of an everyman myth figure, it's kind of that's the point. It is a representation of you. You are Jesus. You are Jesus on this allegorical journey to death and rebirth, which is gnosis of God. That's the journey you're on. And the whole thing is you. And the key thing is that you will get told that. And what we can see in the ancient mysteries, the pagan mysteries, is you have the outer mysteries and the inner mysteries. The outer mysteries is when you hear the stories, and the inner mysteries is when you're told what they mean. And I think the Gnostics have clearly got that. And then what we inherited as the Roman Church lost that, just had the outer mysteries. It lost the inner mysteries. It lost anyone. So no one ever took you to one side when you were old enough and went, okay, actually, this is about you. And it's about you experiencing God. No one did that. They just told you had to believe it because it's the story. And that was what we lost. But those inner and outer mysteries were the currency of ancient spirituality in the mysteries. That's what the mystery schools were about. And you can still see that in people like Clement of Alexandria, for instance, where he's constantly talking about them as allegories and trying to understand the allegorical meaning of the story. And that's what we did I mentioned Jesus and the Lost Goddess. That's what we did in that book. We just go right into it and go, look, this is what the story means, perhaps. I think this is what it means. And that's when it comes to life. And for me, that's the most convincing bit of the whole, the argument, which we can't go into, but you're well aware. It's like, oh well, there's no historical evidence for Jesus, so that's gone. And there's all of these similarities with paganism, so that needs explaining. And then you've got this group, the Gnostics, whose great heresy is they don't think Jesus came in the flesh, and they understand the Gospels allegorically. So it's like the simplest parsimonious explanation is it's another one. There's all these other pagan groups who are doing it. It's a Jewish group doing it. It's a simple explanation. And then when you go into it and you go, oh, look, and this seems to be what it's saying. And you can take, why is there 12 disciples? Well, just a coincidence. It was like, could have been 10, could have been 13, turned out to be 12. Or, okay, no, that's the 12 tribes, but it's also the 12 signs of the zodiac. You've got Jesus in the middle, leading round dances in one of the Gnostic Gospels, just like they would do in the Mithraic mysteries, so that the disciples are the 12 states of being on the wheel. What's the wheel? Well, it's the wheel of grief. What in the East, people know it better now, is the wheel of suffering, which is you're stuck on the wheel, which is the movement of the stars. And you need to find the still point, which is the pole star, which is the Christ. And that's in you. You find the still point in yourself, which doesn't move, which doesn't change, which is your divine essence. So from little things like that, right the way through to the motif of death and rebirth, or there is symbolic meaning in all of these little stories, which is why they're in there, because each one is a little parable that someone will unpack and go, so this is what it means. So this is what it means. So this is what it means, until you have this hugely, like a textbook. It's like the myth is like a spiritual textbook, which you can then take all the different chapters from and go, oh, that's what it's about. And there's different versions of it because different people have created it and different schools have had influences on it as it's grown, as it got both positively and negatively. I'm sure it's got distorted as well.
One of the things that's in the New Testament, I think it's in the Gospel of John, that says that Satan is actually, no, this is in Paul. Yep, it's in Paul. Paul says, it's in 2 Corinthians, that the ruler of the God of this world, now that's typically interpreted as Satan. Oh, other arguments like, oh, he wasn't being too specific that it was Satan. What do you think about that? And how
I think he's a Gnostic. Now, not all Paul's letters are Gnostic, and I think they've all been tampered with over the centuries. I think for sure, but I think if you go by, I think the Gnostic Elaine Pagels has done an excellent job on really showing. Okay, right. So, and not just her. But the original Paul is a Gnostic. He's the great hero of the Gnostics. Valentinus says that he was taught by Theudas. Theudas was taught by Paul. He's part of that heritage. So my suspicion is, it's not like, is it Satan or is it Jehovah? It's like they're the same figure for certain Gnostics. And all they're really saying is there is a power which is keeping us entrapped here. And it's a fallen thing. And it's also, if you look at their mythology of the syzygies, very similar to Kabbalah. My guess is that Kabbalah is quite old too, but and it's also Pythagorean, but it's Jewish Pythagoreanism. So that you can see, I think my guess is that what happens around the time that all of this is going on is that Jewish Gnosticism splits into what will become Kabbalah and what will become Christianity. And they're very similar. And they've got this idea of a fall, which is common in most of the, also in the Platonists as well. So you've got the emanation from the highest falling into the lowest and now trying to get back. And in Kabbalah, it's the idea of dark, where there's a breaking of the vessels. It's going to fall, the emanation of the divinity is going to fall until eventually it's in matter, and then you have to escape matter and get back to God. And it's the same with the idea of the syzygies in the Gnostic mythology, so the last one is the final fall is going to be Jehovah for them, or the demiurge, and so that's the power of this world, which you then have to overcome to start climbing back up the ladder in order to reclaim your divinity. That's where their theology had got to.
Well, thank you for joining me, Dr. Timothy Freke. It's been a wonderful discussion, and because our hour is just about up here, and if you'd like, I hope to one day chat with you again. This has been very fun.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it very much. I'm sorry I'm so short of time, Jacob.
Sure.
To accommodate you, but I'm working on other things now, that's where my attention is. But it is lovely to speak with someone who's informed and to revisit some of these ideas, which are really important to me and part of my past, my own particular heritage. And I'm very encouraged by people like yourself and how much has changed. If I look back to when we wrote the Jesus Mysteries, there was nothing really in the public view at all. I mean, someone launched a Jesus Mysteries Yahoo group, I think it was, and it was the biggest one in the whole of religion for a while. It was huge. And because there was nothing else, it was like a whole new thing. And then realizing, there were other people as well following the similar strands. And the next thing you know, it has become a considerable cultural movement, and people have picked it up, and I'm sure done other great work that I'm not even aware of. And people like yourself bringing together the different people's different insights and is a huge part of that. So I'm so pleased you're doing it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.